Hey guys, welcome back to the Lesbian Book Club podcast. It's me, Haylie, today, and I am going to take you through real historical figures in our next book that we're reading, and I'm so excited about it. Our next book is CRAZE by Margaret Vandenburg, so please get to reading, people, and when I tell you, this book is so good, I have not been able to put it down. Margaret was so kind as to send both Lauren and I copies of this book. And for one, I love having a hard copy book in my hand. It's really exciting. But as I've been reading this, I've been noticing these names popping up where I was like, I definitely think that's a real person. And I don't really know anything about them, but I feel like obviously they're important to be in this book. And what's cool about it is that they are real characters that our main character in CRAZE, Henri, interacts with. And I'm not going to tell you anything about the story because I don't want to spoil anything for you. And we'll obviously talk about that in our episode about CRAZE with Lauren here, of course. But I wanted to talk about some of these people that Margaret brings up because I feel like it will enrich your reading experience because I wanted to be looking these people up as I was reading. So let's get into it.
Where are the quiet gays? Where are the quiet gays supposed to go?
This book is taking place during the Prohibition era in the United States, which is also the setting of the queer craze. So there are a lot of figures in this book that came to fame through the queer craze. And what that means is that during the Prohibition era, a lot of underground life was coming to life because people were seeking underground clubs and speakeasies in order to get alcohol. And in order to do that, you are giving up your, I would say, moral high ground if you are anti-queer. You pick up what I'm saying here? And so you enter on the same playing field if you are in one of these clubs. Everybody's on the same playing field. So, queer life was rich in these places. And so there was a lot of out queer people. There were drag queens, performers. And so the people I'm going to talk about today will be some performers. There's also going to be some intellectuals and writers and artists. And these were the people running in the circles of our main character in the book. So if that excites you, I'd get to reading people so you can listen next week. I think it'll be next week. So, all right, let's get going. The first person I want to talk about is Jean Malin. And Jean Malin was a famous drag queen who was about 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, and was known for having this blonde hair. And so this is like a very large man, right? Who is also a drag queen. And Jean Malin was known for being confrontational and fighting homophobes. So already, like, we love Jean. There's this story about Malin walking into a bar in Greenwich Village and getting heckled by a bunch of drunk men outside. And he was not having it. And so he took a champagne bottle off of a table and he broke it on the table and started fighting these men. And this fight lasted over an hour and sent 12 men to the hospital. So just imagine this scene. And there's a version of the story that says that the reason that this heckling started when he walked up is because he was in drag. So just imagine this large drag queen in drag fighting 12 men, sending them to the hospital in a bar outside in Greenwich Village. Like, just a wild scene. So this establishment later was shut down by the cops, but that's a good story about Jean Malin. Another kind of interesting fact about him is that he had a lisp. Also, just to clarify, Jean Malin is his stage name. Jean grew up in New York City to Lithuanian and Polish parents, and by the time he was a teenager, he was winning contests for costumes that he had made himself all around New York City, which is really, really cool. And also, if we think about this, like, this is in the 1920s, right? So in the 1920s, this little boy was making his own clothes and drag costumes and winning awards for them. I mean, that's unusual. That's so very unusual. And he was confident in his sexuality from a young age. Like, this is a boy who knew who he was. He worked as an MC out of drag with some of the top drag performers across New York City. And there were lots of hecklers who would say homophobic things to him and to the performers. And he never took it. He did not let them have peace. He would put them in their place on stage in front of everybody. He also was one of the highest paid performers on Broadway as a chorus boy in the 1930s, which is very cool. Jean Malin had some things fall apart for him in New York City, though, when the mob scene got a little messy and ugly in New York City. So the mobs were running the Prohibition era speakeasies and clubs because obviously they weren't government approved, right? So the mobs take control. They're all fighting each other, blah, blah, blah. So his workplaces are no longer a good place to be. So he comes to LA and he opens his own club, which he calls the Club New Yorker. And that only lasted a year. But then he gets into film and he played a Mae West impersonator in a film. And that was pretty successful. And so then he was in a few other films, but he got cut out of the final cuts because he was too effeminate. And tragically, in 1933, okay, before I tell you this, there's a key piece of information here. LA starts to ban drag performers. So Malin has a farewell performance at the Santa Monica Pier, okay? And something very tragic happens. He's 25 years old, and he goes to leave after his performance, gets in his car, and has a little mix-up with his gears and accidentally reverses off the pier and drowns and dies. Really tragic. He had his partner and one of his friends in the car with him, and they both were severely injured, but they survived. But Jean Malin will always be remembered. He had a caricature published of him in the Vanity Fair. After he died, his 2 songs that he recorded were released, and those are I'd Rather Be Spanish Than Manish, and That's What's the Matter With Me. And he's been largely credited with the pansy craze, which is the queer craze, and the out queer culture of the Prohibition era. And when he died, it largely died with him. So, Jean Malin, thank you for your contribution to the queer craze and queer culture. Very cool story. And I'm going to move on to Gladys Bentley, who I think that this is such a wild story. And I really didn't know anything about Gladys Bentley. I had absolutely heard her name before, but I just didn't know who she was. And I started reading this book and I was like, okay, I have to know about her. And I've been reading about her and I am just stunned at the way that things turned for her. But you'll find out, okay? So Gladys Bentley she was a Black woman with her signature white top hat, tuxedo, and tails. And she was known for singing very raunchy, provocative songs in clubs, okay? She was a part of the Harlem Renaissance, and she played piano while she sang her songs, and she was just like a very strong performer. She had a deep voice. She played the keys really well and strong, and she had really, really strong stage presence. So she moved from Philly as a teen to Harlem, and that's when she got into the intellectual and music culture of the time and was drawn into the Harlem Renaissance. And she started her career playing at rent parties, and then at these rent parties, she was changing the lyrics to popular songs, and it was changing them into like just really explicit things, like about anal sex. And then she started going and playing at clubs, and the venues would advertise her as a male impersonator because of her deep voice and how she would flirt with women during her sets and how she kind of dressed like a man. And very famous people would come to see her, like Langston Hughes, who said that she was, quote, an amazing exhibition of musical energy, a large, dark, masculine lady whose feet pounded the floor while her fingers pounded the keyboard, a perfect piece of African sculpture animated by her own rhythm. Okay? So, in CRAZE, we see her play at the Clam House. She also played at famous clubs like the Cotton Club. She drew large crowds to these clubs. Really interesting is she drew a lot of white patrons from outside of Harlem. And if you remember what time this is the 1930s now in the United States. And it's not exactly a nice time racially in the United States. All right. So this was a woman who united people through her performance and her music. According to a gossip column of the time, Gladys confirmed a marriage between her and a white woman. Again, with the time, like, not only just was this an interracial marriage in the 1930s in the United States, but this was also a marriage between two women in the 1930s, which to publicly state that in a magazine is very bold of her. All right. So after the Prohibition era, when that ended, people weren't as attracted to the provocative nature of her performances, unfortunately. So she went to LA and began making music and touring in high-class clubs where she had less raunchy lyrics. She really toned herself down. But then here's the really interesting part of Gladys's story that I am just perplexed by. In the 1950s, this is, if you remember back to the Telegraph Club, we talked about McCarthyism. Okay, it's a very conservative time where it was frowned upon to be gay and to not be a traditional woman. Gladys publicly remade herself, and she wrote an article for Ebony magazine titled "I Am a Woman Again," where she said that she had undergone medical treatment to awaken her, quote, womanliness. The article had photos of her looking very feminine, doing feminine things, tending to her husband, and she married twice, by the way, in this time period. Her first husband, like, completely denied that they have ever been together. And people think that Gladys doing this was likely a response to the McCarthy era and how queer people were perceived as national threats and associated with things like communism. But there are some people who think that Gladys was, let's say, a marketer, let's say like a Kris Kardashian, who knew what people wanted, what was selling at the time, and knew that this kind of very feminine housewife energy was selling in the 1950s, and she was trying to make money. So, I mean, there's two different takes here. What the truth is, we'll probably never know, because Gladys died in 1960 of pneumonia, and we can't ask her. But Gladys remained a performer until 1958, and she left quite the legacy. Really cool woman, and if you have a chance to look her up, I highly suggest you do. Quick break for me to open my kombucha, little ASMR for you all. The next person I want to talk about is Carol Norman, also known as the Creole Fashion Plate. And both of these are drag names, performer names. Carol Norman was a drag queen popular in vaudeville, nightclubs, and Broadway in the 1920s. And this is an interesting fact. There was a club in West Hollywood called La Boheme that Carol opened for in 1932. And I don't think that it's the same one, but there is still a restaurant in West Hollywood called La Boheme that I have been to. And that's just kind of a cool little tidbit of information. I really don't think it's the same one because the La Boheme in question closed and then reopened as something else. And I don't think that they would have closed and then reopened again. But I don't know. I'll have to ask. Carol's signature act was of Joan Crawford in the movie Rain. And after doing this drag performance for a while, Carol returned to vaudeville and opened his own club. The thing about Carol's story that I am just in love with is that his mother made his gowns and traveled with him, which is so cool. Like, here we are in the 1930s with an affirming mom who is supportive of the drag and is like a momager. I am so excited about that. I am a huge fan of Carol Norman's mom. Carol specialized in Southern songs and very quickly changing clothes and genders on stage. And what I mean by changing genders on stage is just like being able to change her voice and the way that they're presenting themselves between like masculine and feminine very quickly. He was arrested on a morals charge in Detroit, but Eleanor Roosevelt actually intervened to release him, which is cool of Eleanor Roosevelt and also kind of tells you how much attention Carol Norman was getting, that Eleanor Roosevelt was aware of the existence of him and also like the arrest and willing to step in and get him released. When his mother died, he retired, and then he passed away in 1947. Next up, we have Gertrude Stein, who is very often mentioned in CRAZE. Gertrude Stein was an American expat living in Paris, a writer, and a very central figure in the Parisian art world and an advocate of the avant-garde. Which makes sense as to why Gertrude would be in this book, because if you read CRAZE, you'll find out that the main character, Henri, is very involved with the avant-garde art world. So, Gertrude shared the Paris salon at 27 Rue des Fleurs with Alice B. Toklas, who was her lifelong companion and secretary. And the salon was a gathering place for new moderns or talented young artists and launched many painters' careers, including Pablo Picasso. Which, so cool, like huge. Hello, Pablo Picasso. She was experimental and wrote using process and rejected things like plot and dialogue. And because of this, Gertrude is not super understood, let's say, by many people. Most of her work is not a great seller because she basically writes as like a stream of consciousness and is very process oriented and just like really experimental, which isn't how people typically read. Like, it's not going to be like your New York Times bestseller. You know what I'm saying? But she was really, really socially influential, and in her art circles, she was a mentor to a lot of these really influential artists. So members of the Lost Generation, which are American expats living in Europe, like Ernest Hemingway, Scott F. Fitzgerald, Sherwood Anderson, James Joyce, who wrote Ulysses, they all came to her salon, and it's been debated about whether or not they were influenced by her in their writing. She was known as imposing, self-confident, and commanding. And before she ended up in Paris, she actually grew up in California. And then she went to Radcliffe College studying psychology and then medical school. But then she failed her classes and then she moved to Europe for art. Her only bestseller was an autobiography that she actually wrote through the voice of her partner, Alice, which is a really cool concept. And this made her a sensation in the United States. She came back for like a press tour of sorts in the US, and they announced her arrival with a billboard in Times Square. She had tea with Eleanor Roosevelt and dinner with Charlie Chaplin in Beverly Hills. And then in the 1980s, sorry, let me back up. After that, she went back to Europe, never came back to the US. And that was kind of that. And then in the 1980s, Yale unlocked a cabinet full of love letters between Alice and Gertrude, which this is so precious, you guys. She called Alice Baby Precious, and Alice called her Mr. Cuddlewaddle. I died at this. I love this so much. Like, these big figures in history are just people like us who call each other Mr. Cuddlewaddle. Like, I just love it. The New York Times dubbed her apartment the first museum of modern art. It was full of Picassos. Like, come on. And Miss Gertrude left us in 1946. Next up, we've got Natalie Barney, another writer and American expat living in Paris who hosted weekly salons. And she was celebrated for openly living and writing as a lesbian. A cool little fact about her is that she was nicknamed the Amazon because she rode a horse straddling it instead of with both legs to the side like women at the time were supposed to do, which is so funny to me. Like, wow. You crazy woman. You rode a horse regular. You're an Amazon. Like, what is the... Men are insane. Why are we doing this? Anyway, okay. She was born on Halloween, so soon. Happy birthday, Natalie. She was a rich kid. She grew up rich. She went to French boarding schools, and then her dad died, and she got a huge inheritance that set her up for life. And she decided to go and have this salon, essentially. But as a kid, she was rebellious and intelligent, and she liked her art and writing. For 60 years, she lived at 20 Rue Jacob, and that's where she held her salon. She formed the Academy of Women. It's actually a French thing, a French name, but I'm not even going to try that because I will butcher it. But She formed the Academy of Women in 1927 in response to the French Academy, which only admitted men. So, boss move. Thank you, Natalie. And she was a prolific writer. She just wrote constantly. And in her writings, she covered pacifism, homosexuality, feminism, and paganism. And she was known for her epigraphs, which are these, like, what Lauren would call a gut punch line. Some examples of these are: youth is not a question of years, one is young or old from birth, and there are more evil ears than bad mouths, and eternity, waste of time. So those are all Natalie Barney lines. Natalie was lesbian and non-monogamous, and so in the 1920s in France, her life garnered a lot of attention. She was the center of a lot of gossip and speculation and writings because she was very socially important. So, the same way that we talk about celebrities, she was getting talked about. So she had many novels based off of her romances, actually. Like, not that she wrote, that other people wrote. And Natalie died in 1972 at the age of 96. She lived a long time. The last person that I want to talk about is Ernest Hemingway. So he's a part of this book. He is obviously very famous for his poetry. And he is not, like, historically known to be queer. If you have noticed, all of the people I've talked about so far are known as a fact to have been queer. But there's some, like little whispers, little birdies in the ear, little rumors about our guy, Ernie Hemingway. So I'm just going to talk about it. I don't think I need to tell you about his poetry. I think you probably know, if you're listening to a book club podcast, you probably have heard of our guy. But I'm going to tell you a little bit, just a little bit, because I'm not going to, sit here and gossip and make stuff up about a dead guy. But I'm just going to tell you what's already out there. So he put out a very masculine persona, Ernest did. He hung out a lot at Gertrude Stein's salon. And he was rumored to be maybe gay, at least sexually confused, and quite androgynous when you met him in person, even though he put out a super masculine persona in his writings and tried to be really macho when he was writing. He was known to have had a complicated relationship with his mother, who was kind of emasculating to him. And when he was a child, used to dress him up as a girl. He had a sister, and she would dress them up as twin girls. And it's thought that maybe he's a little bit confused because of that. But who knows? We can't ask him again. His characters that he wrote about, this is where some speculation comes from. His characters were often confronting issues of transsexuality and gender. If you're writing about that stuff, maybe you're having your own thoughts about that stuff, but we can never be sure because he's not here to ask. So you take your own thoughts about that and do with them what you will. I'm also going to throw out there that Georgia O'Keeffe and Pablo Picasso are mentioned in this book a lot. They are also real people and real artists, and I hope you know that. They are very, very famous. Pablo Picasso is a painter who is known for... he did lots of different styles. He had some eras, but he's most famous for a lot of his cubism. And Georgia O'Keeffe is very famous for the nature and flowers that she would paint. And neither of them are queer, to our knowledge. So I'm not going to go into that, but I also encourage you to look up some things about them if you'd like to. They're cool people. So I want to just thank some of the sources that I got my information from. And if you want to learn more, you can also go to these places. So the American Masters of Drag, hosted by Peppermint on PBS. The Legacy Project Chicago. The Great Blues Singer Gladys Bentley Broke All the Rules by Halimah Shah for the Smithsonian. The Performing Arts Archive, West Hollywood History Center, the Poetry Foundation, the Salon Host, the Brooklyn Museum, the New York Times, and the Paris Review all gave me great information about these people. And please read CRAZE by Margaret Vandenburg for our next episode. It's truly so good. I can't put it down. I'm really, really excited to talk about it and excited to talk to Lauren about it and Margaret later. So I can't wait to talk to you guys next time. Love you. Bye.